it's 7th phone or 9th phone according to a scale. Something very useful. There was not too much science in that article, but I think the right idea to have a loudness scale that users do understand. I think that's where loudness research actually starts with Fletcher and Munson, equal loudness contours in the 1930s. They had their participants adjust the level of a sound to sound equally loud as a 1 kilohertz pure tone. And that's shown in the equal loudness contours. For example, around 3 to 4 kilohertz, you see that you need less level to sound equally loud as a 1 kilohertz pure tone, or in other words, 3 to 4 kilohertz is a bit louder because of the amplification of the ear canal. And at lower frequencies, like at 100 hertz, you see two things. First, you need a higher level than at 1 kilohertz to sound equally loud, because 100 hertz at the same level would be softer. And more importantly, you also see that the difference between two contours for having a difference of 10 phones is less than 10 decibels. In other words, if you increase the level by 10 decibels at 100 hertz, then loudness changes by something like 20 decibels. And this is a bit unfortunate for our A-weighted levels or weighted levels that we are using. There's more unfortunate than just not considering this compression. First of all, at the beginning, there were more weightings than just A-weighting. A-weighting was based on the 40 phone contour. And 40 phone is rather soft. I think you don't have anyone complaining about an aircraft with a loudness level of 40 phone, but unfortunately it's used. Why is it used? Well, if I was a noisemaker, I would love the A-weighting because it suppresses the low frequencies more than higher curves. So here the difference between 1 kilohertz and 100 hertz at 40 phone is about 20 decibels. If you go to a higher curve like the 100 phone curve, there is not any difference. So you get smaller dBA values for low frequency sounds, or smaller decibels value for low frequency sounds with A weighting than with other weightings. And the other unfortunate thing of those weightings is when you choose one like dBA, then you don't reflect that your low frequencies, if they increase by 20 decibels, by 10 decibels, it corresponds to a much higher increase or decrease in loudness. Equal loudness contours are highly influential. That's why they have been standardized a few times. The latest standard is from 2023, which is based on data that was collected for the 23 standards from 12 studies all around the world. They look similar, not exactly the same, but we are very interested in having that as accurate as possible. Frequency is not the only effect that influences loudness. That is work by Zwicker, who emphasized that spectral loudness summation has a huge effect on loudness. And for studying that, he let his subjects compare a pure tone, which you see on the y-axis, to a broadband noise, a uniformly exciting noise, investigating what is the level that you need for the pure tone to sound equally loud as the broadband noise. They have about the same dBA level, but as you see here, you need around 80 decibels for 1 kilohertz pure tone to sound equally loud as a 60 decibels uniformly exciting noise. So the spectral loudness summation, if you express this in decibels, amounts up to 20 decibels. And Zwicker did more studies on spectral loudness summation. He was interested in how broad does the sound need to be to give some increase in loudness, and he invented the so-called Frequenzgruppen or critical bands. Up to a certain bandwidth, there is no increase in loudness when you increase the bandwidth, but beyond that bandwidth, beyond the critical bandwidth, loudness increases with bandwidth. And those were the main ingredients for his model, in addition to masking. It was already well known from Bekeshi that when you present a pure tone, the basilar membrane is not just excited at a single place, but you have a traveling wave that excites the basilar membrane across a longer range, and that leads to spectral masking. When you present a tone at around 1 kilohertz, then it masks tones at higher frequencies and to some extent also at low frequencies. And Zwicker studied that extensively. Those masking patterns, they are not parallel. They get more broad when you increase in level. And from those masking patterns, Zwicker inferred that you can infer what happens on the basilar membrane or in the organ of Corti and have so-called excitation patterns of the basilar membrane or in the organ of Corti that you see on the right-hand side based on masking data. And that led him to form his first model in 1958, which is much older than the standards that he later created. And the model is rather simple. You have a sound as an input, in this example, a pure tone. Based on the pure tone, you calculate the basilar membrane displacement. And from the basilar membrane displacement, you can calculate how much that excites the organ of Corti, how much excites the hair cells. And this excitation is then converted to a quantity called specific loudness, which has the purpose that you can sum specific loudness across frequency to calculate loudness. And this is shown on the right side for two sounds. One is a pure tone and the other one is a broadband noise. You see the specific loudness for both of these sounds. Both of them have 100 decibels sound pressure level. And the area under the pure tone is less than the area under the broadband noise, or in other words, the broadband noise is louder at the same level. These computations, these calculations, they have nonlinear equations in them. So it was quite an effort to do that at the time. Zwicker, if you ever go to Munich, the Technical University of Munich, you see a device built with electronic circuits to calculate loudness. It was not very practical. He built smaller devices, but to make it available to many users, Zwicker invented those third octave based method, which does the same calculation, but with pen and paper. You can measure third octaves level. They were widely available at the time. You could measure third octaves, and then you measure your third octaves. You draw those third octave loudnesses into this table. After that, you draw the masking slopes parallel to the dashed lines that you see in the diagram. You connect all of that, and that gives you an area under your third octave level diagram. And that area corresponds to loudness. This was later standardized in ISO and in the German DIN standard. And it still forms the basis for present day Zwicker model, or as I like to call it, Zwicker-Fastel model, because Professor Fastel did a lot of research as well. So this is standardized in 5321. It forms the basis for this. This is based on a spectrum. And you can, of course, also calculate it for time-varying sounds, which I will talk later about with the Cambridge model. Some problems based on those masking patterns that are highly important for Zwicker's model. Zwicker determined those masking slopes with two tones. One tone as the masker and another tone as the tone to be masked. And you get distortion products and various effects that could lead to a subject, to a participant, to perceive the tone or to perceive something that leads to an answer that says, I can hear something, which does not necessarily correspond to the auditory filters. There were other experiments about auditory filters. At the time, Fletcher already found out that when you increase the bandwidth of a noise to some extent to mask a 1 kilohertz pure tone, at some point it doesn't matter anymore. When you extend the bandwidth, only those frequencies close to 1 kilohertz within one critical band, they contribute to masking that 1 kilohertz. Problem with that was that you would assume that an auditory filter has a rectangular shape, and hardly anything in a human system is rectangular. And that's why Roy Patterson came up with a more fancy method to measure the actual shape of an auditory filter that doesn't need to be rectangular. And he used the so-called notched noise method. And in the notched noise method, you present the signal of interest as a pure tone at one given frequency, and you try to mask that pure tone with 2 bands of noise to each side, so that gets rid of any distortion products. And the principle is that whatever intensity of the maskers falls within the auditory filter, that contributes to masking. The noise that's outside of the auditory filter does not contribute to the masking of the pure tone. And if you do that for different spacings between the signal and the masker of different width, and also symmetric and asymmetric, then you can compute the shape of the auditory filter. So you would have no spacing at all. That gives you how efficient you are in detecting the pure tone and noise. Then you could increase it a bit, and you need higher masker level the more you increase the notch, because you have less falling into that auditory filter. And by having those spacings not just symmetric but asymmetric, you get information on how steep the filter is towards lower frequencies and how steep that filter is towards higher frequencies. And these auditory filters are the basis of the Cambridge loudness model to calculate the excitation patterns according with the Cambridge loudness model. For stationary sound, for spectra, the Cambridge model looks quite similar to what Zwicker postulated in 1958. The principle of the most basic Cambridge model is you have a sound, you calculate its spectrum, you consider the outer ear, you consider the middle ear, then you want to calculate what happens on the basilar membrane, and that's where you use this auditory filter to calculate the excitation patterns on the basilar membrane. These excitation patterns are then converted from a decibel representation to specific loudness given in zone per auditory filter, or zone per ERB, which stands for equivalent rectangular bandwidth of an auditory filter, so that you can sum this specific loudness to yield the total loudness. And this model was published by Moore and Glassberg, and 1 year later again by Moore, Glassberg, and Baer, and it formed the basis for ANSI S3.4. So this is for stationary sound. It only works for a spectrum. It considers 2 of the most important effects for loudness, in addition to level and frequency, and those 2 important effects are spectral loudness summation and masking or excitation patterns. Another effect of loudness is the binaural summation. And binaural summation is important when you have scenarios where you have sounds from a given direction, or where you have headphones and might listen to a sounds on 1 ear only or on 2 ears only. And that's how it was first investigated with headphones. Question is, what level increase do you need for a sound on 1 ear to have the same loudness as a sound on 2 ears? According to Stevens' power law, you would need 10 decibels more for 1 ear than having it on 2 ears. And that was supported by early data that loudness sums perfectly across the 2 ears. So the level difference for equal loudness would be 10 decibels. However, newer research has shown that the level difference is more like 5 to 6 decibels. And this can be explained that there is some inhibition between the 2 ears. So if you present a sound on the right ear, that inhibits the loudness on the left ear before it is then summed across both ears. So the 2 ears, they reduce the loudness at each ear, but then they sum up again. So the level difference for equal loudness is not 10 decibels, but rather 5 to 6 decibels, or a factor of 1.5 in loudness, not 2. And this was also incorporated by the Cambridge model for binaural sounds. And it looks more complex now, mainly because you have 2 streams, 1 for each ear. And there is one additional stage here. after you calculate specific loudness, you calculate smoothed specific loudness, because the binaural inhibition is a rather broad effect. So in other words, when you have a low frequency, let's say 500 hertz, that inhibits quite high frequencies and vice versa. So that's why before you calculate how much the binaural inhibition is, you smooth the specific loudness so that you consider that it's a broadly tuned effect. But apart from that, it's very similar. So first we have outer ear, middle ear, we calculate excitation patterns, we transform that to specific loudness, and then we calculate the inhibited specific loudness on each ear, and then we sum across the two ears and across auditory filters to yield loudness. So this is still for stationary sounds, but as we know, most sounds in the real world are not stationary. They change over time, and they change all the time. It's to some extent the definition of a sound that we have changing amplitude. But even on a more broader time scale, you have vehicles that are moving, you have speech syllables that are sometimes louder, sometimes I pause. You have sounds like rotorcraft, who you might say, well, maybe that's a constant loudness, but you have those repetitive pulses. So if you have a longer time span between pulses, then you would say, okay, now loudness is up, then it goes down. So loudness changes all the time. And that's why all ISO models now, both for Zwicker and Moore-Glasberg, are for time varying sounds. And in the Moore-Glasberg model or the Cambridge model, we have three quantities of time varying loudness. The first that we calculate is instantaneous loudness, and we calculate that from the short-term spectrum. We make the temporal window as short as possible, 2 milliseconds for the high frequencies, up to 64 milliseconds for the lowest frequencies, so that we can convert to the frequency domain. Based on that, we calculate the spectrum, the excitation patterns, and so on. And we calculate instantaneous loudness that is there at one specific at one specific moment. It's an intervening variable. It's thought that instantaneous loudness is not something that we consciously perceive. So we have it in the model because it's useful, but it's nothing that corresponds to human perception. That's why the next step is to calculate something that we can perceive, and that is short-term loudness. And short-term loudness is thought to correspond to the loudness of a brief segment of a sound, for example, of a syllable. When you follow my speech, you might analyze the speech over time, and you might say some syllables are louder, some syllables are not so loud. And how is that done? It's calculated from instantaneous loudness with two exponential time constants, like in an automatic gain control circuit. And those exponential time attacks, when instantaneous loudness increases, it doesn't increase immediately, but has a time constant of 22 milliseconds. That's a rather short time constant, which models that loudness can increase quite rapidly. And similar, when a sound event finishes, it doesn't lead to a decrease in loudness immediately. There is some persistent activity in the auditory system. And in some experiments with binaural sounds that vary over time, we found out that 30 milliseconds is the best time constant to model our data. And this is quite interesting because a time constant of 30 milliseconds in that order of magnitude also models so-called post-masking, temporal masking by Fastel and Zwicker quite well. So I think that's a time constant that corresponds to various effects, and I'm quite happy to have it in the model. I'm not so sure about the 22 milliseconds, as I'll tell you later. Maybe it builds up faster or not. That was about the loudness of a syllable. We have a third concept that we call long-term loudness, which is for longer segments of sounds, up to 5 seconds. We think after 5 seconds, there could be further changes in loudness, but it's basically when you listen to my speech, you don't think that I change my loudness all the time. You would say, okay, the speech is so and so loud, despite syllables changing. And this is considered by long-term loudness, what a subject would tell you about the loudness of a longer segment, like, for example, a sentence or like a musical phrase. And long-term loudness, again, is calculated with an automatic gain control circuit. From short-term loudness, we have an attack time of 99 milliseconds that models the effect of loudness depending on duration quite well. Loudness increases with duration up to about 200 milliseconds. The data for that vary greatly across experiments. You find on the shorthand time constants like 15 milliseconds and on the long hand like 500 milliseconds. But Scharf summarized various studies and he concluded it's about 200 milliseconds or 150 to 200 milliseconds. So exponential attack time of 99 milliseconds models quite nicely. For long-term loudness, we have a release time of 750 milliseconds. So when I make a short pause in my speech, you wouldn't immediately judge it as softer. It needs some time to get loudness down. And this model for time-varying sound led to pretty good predictions for a variety of sounds of speech that was treated in various ways, for time-varying sounds like sonic booms, for various machinery sounds. And this is the basis of our ISO 5323 standard. The next step was we have a model for binaural stationary sound and for time-varying sounds. We would like to have one model for all of them. That's why we kind of married those two models together. And in doing so, there is one question, and that question is, at which stage should you do binaural inhibition and at which stage should you do binaural summation? And we thought binaural inhibition, that's something that could happen rather early, quite soon. But there's also evidence that the binaural system is a bit sluggish, so that's why we thought binaural summation happens later than binaural inhibition. And that's why we came up with that model, or the order of blocks in that model, in that order. I will go through all of it to repeat. So first, for each ear, we go through the outer ear, through the middle ear. We determine the spectrum, the instantaneous spectrum. We transform that spectrum to excitation patterns. Then we transform the excitation patterns to specific instantaneous loudness. We apply the automatic gain control to calculate specific short-term loudness. And then we calculate binaural inhibition. After that, we sum across the auditory filters and calculate long-term loudness. And only at the very end, we sum across the two ears to model that binaural summation happens later than binaural inhibition. And we tested that with, I would say, quite fancy stimuli. We have two modulated pure tones, but their modulation varies across the two ears, shifted across the two ears. When you have a modulation phase difference of 0 degrees, then you have the same signal in both ears, it goes up and down. But we also applied modulation phase differences of 90 degrees or 180 degrees. 180 degrees means you go up and down exactly in the opposite. So one ear is at the maximum, the other at the minimum, and vice versa. And why does this matter? If binaural inhibition and summation was instantaneous, then you would have the highest loudness for the same modulation phase, because when both are at the maximum, both are summed, and that yields the highest loudness. If you have inhibition and summation not at the same time, but like we have modeled it, then you would expect a higher loudness for a modulation phase difference of 180 degrees, because now when the blue sound, the left sound, is at the maximum, you don't have much inhibition if it's near instantaneous, but then you maintain this loudness that is not inhibited over time. So you sum two loudnesses that are higher. So a fancy principle to test them is 0 degrees louder or is 180 degrees louder. And we got negative level differences for equal loudness with 0 degree as the comparison sound. So in other words, because of the negative level difference for equal loudness, our 180 degree sounds or 90 degree sounds are louder. So this is actual evidence that binaural summation happens later than binaural inhibition. For a modulation phase difference of 90 degrees, whether we have a small overall level of 30 decibels or high of 70 decibels, the effect is not too big, but it's predicted rather well by our loudness model. And I say the effect is not too big, it's 1 decibels, but remember the whole effect of binaural summation is only 5 to 6 decibels. So the effect for 180 degrees of up to 2 decibels is quite considerable from a model perspective. And we found that the model where we haven't changed anything except putting the blocks in the right order quite nicely predicts that effect. However, right here we found a high discrepancy between the prediction by the model predicting a rather large effect and our data saying that, yeah, it's not that much louder. And that led us to thinking more about the time constants that we used. For the 2016 model, we used a release time for long-term loudness of 2 seconds. And when we decrease that 2 seconds to 750 milliseconds, then we get a nice fit to that data. So I would say 750 milliseconds, that's still in the same order of magnitude as 2 seconds, makes a huge difference to our data. Those 2 seconds when the two Brians, Moore and Glassberg, first did their model, I think it wasn't actually based on hard data, but more an experience in like how long do we maintain loudness. There are concepts like the present in perception, which is around 2 seconds, which might have led them to postulate it. So based on the fact that they postulated that model and then we experimentally found something that's not too far away is quite good evidence for the good modeling work. That was about loudness in silence, how we do it in the lab, how we do it in scenarios like on the left-hand sides on a free field where we don't have any other competing noise. And I think, and several of you think, that this is a scenario that's not highly ecologically valid. No one complains about an aircraft flying over that field because no one is there. So scenarios that we have more often are scenarios where we have people, where we have noise sources, like for example, in a city. So to judge how annoying a sound is or how unwanted a sound is, it would make more sense to calculate the loudness in the presence of other sounds where that sound is partially masked. And we have a model for that. And it's important to consider that masking or partial masking by other sounds for various reasons. If your target sound has a much higher level than the background noise, then the loudness is almost similar to that in quiet. For example, here an SNR of 20 decibels would mean I have 85 decibels broadband noise. My loudness level is around 100 phone. That would be the same as in silence. When my target is much softer, then of course I don't hear it at all. It's fully masked. But there is an interesting region when my target sound has a lower level than the background noise, when it's already audible and potentially annoying. And this is a main ingredient to the partial loudness model, that sounds are audible when they have less level than the background sound, and they have some loudness, and if you increase the level further, then they get their full loudness as they would have in quiet. For practical applications, I think the region between minus and maybe +5 or +10 decibels is the region of highest interest. If you introduce a new sound source that's 20 dB higher than the existing background, then everyone will reject it. If you introduce a new sound source that's 20 decibels lower than the background, then, well, of course, you can add that, no one complains. But most often we operate in that region where you should consider the effects of partial masking. And it's not enough to just consider the overall level. You need to consider that that partial masking could happen at any auditory filter at any critical band. And we have around 40 auditory filters across the frequency range in normal hearing. So here's one example that I took from a random sound in a random, not a fully random background. It is a valid background noise, I think, an urban background noise. Just one time segment where I calculated the specific loudness of my target sound plus the background and the partial specific loudness of my sound. So what happens here is for low frequencies up to 500 Hertz, my target sound is the dominant sound source, so it doesn't get masked by the background sound. But then in up to 1 kilohertz, my target sound gets masked quite a bit by the background sound. So it's softer thanks to the background noise. Or if you want, if you were a sound engineer, you could say, in this frequency region, I could actually increase the intensity a bit without it being perceived as too much. But then we go on, we have the dominant peak here around 1 point something kilohertz, where our target peaks through the background noise and generates some loudness despite the noise. So it's rather complex to consider. We have the effect of partial masking at each auditory filter, and that also changes over time. And to bring our model forward, we did some experiment to further investigate the temporal effect. And for doing so, we presented sequences of bursts in a rather stationary background noise to our participants. The bursts and background noise, they had the same overall spectrum, so that we don't have any spectral effects, only temporal effects. And the signal sounded a bit like a helicopter noise because it was the bursts were repeated with a frequency of 5, 10, or 20 Hertz in our experiment, so like a and the participants were asked just to adjust that loudness of the sequence of bursts to a reference sequence of bursts. The reference consisted of 20 millisecond long bursts and the targets of shorter bursts, 1, 2, 5, or 10 milliseconds. And by doing that, by calculating the level difference for equal loudness between the short durations and the long durations, we can infer how quickly partial loudness builds up. Loudness inquired is typically modeled that the build-up with duration up to 200 milliseconds corresponds to an integration of intensity, or if I consider the root mean square level, then it would be predicted by 0 decibels if I use the RMS level. And our short-term and long-term loudness are quite similar to that 0 dB prediction. But as you see in our experimental results, we get negative level differences for equal loudness, which also depends on the repetition rate. So the higher the repetition rate, the more negative it is, the quicker partial loudness actually builds up. This is something that we have not implemented in the model for partial loudness yet. We think, yeah, maybe partial loudness builds up quicker than loudness in silence because the auditory system is already excited. So there might be a quicker build-up. It's not an instantaneous build-up that you would get when you just consider the burst power, the dashed line. So the concept of short-term loudness is probably correct, or the concept of short-term partial loudness. But to model this data, we would need a faster attack time. And to put it into a model that we want to publish and push forward for a standard, I think we need to confirm that in a bit more data than just these sequences of bursts, and including some real-world sounds. But we are actually working on that. 2 short topics on the end of my talk. Anyone who has used our loudness model knows it's quite slow. We compute the excitation patterns each millisecond in our time-varying loudness model, and our reference code is, I think, around 40 to 50 times of real time. So for 1 minute of sound, you need 40 or 50 minutes of computation time. Commercial solutions are close to real time, but it's not actually great if you want to use it for large databases. And that's why we came up with the idea. So neural networks, they are quite optimized. What if we train a neural network to do the predictions of our loudness model? And in our loudness model, the most problematic part is the calculation of excitation patterns. So we want to have that simulated by a neural network. But we make our life actually easier when we simulate the whole stationary loudness model, where we come from a spectrum to a loudness output. For a neural network, this is just a regression task, what they are designed to do. You have a high-dimensional input and you do a regression to a one-dimensional output. If you don't care what's going on, a neural network is designed to do that. So we gave that neural network target values computed by our loudness model and asked that neural network to predict those predictions of the loudness model. And this is also known as knowledge distillation, which Geoffrey Hinton and colleagues invented to have a simulation of large neural networks by smaller neural networks. Our idea was we simulate a complex perceptual first principles model with a small neural network. For training that neural network, we inserted a lot of artificial sounds so that we have the effects of frequency, the effect of spectral loudness summation, and so on. And we added a few speech sounds as well to have some real world sounds. We then tested the predictions of the neural network on a variety of sounds, the ESC50 database, which has a variety of environmental sounds. We tested it on different speech sounds, and we tested it on music. And the neural network performed quite well. We have an average root mean square error smaller of 0.5 phone. It's better at high loudness level than at low loudness level, because most of our data was at high loudness levels. So if we do that again, we could add more lower loudness levels. But I think in practical applications, it's important to get the high loudness levels correct. That's what contributes to the overall judgment of loudness. That's what people complain about. And since this is in the same order of magnitude than a just noticeable difference in loudness, I think it's quite valid approach to use the neural network instead of our model for time varying loudness. This is just for the basic time varying loudness model, not for partial loudness, not for binaural loudness. I'm working on that, but I haven't gotten root mean square errors in that order of magnitude of a just noticeable difference. Because if I have an RMSE of 3 phone, then you might say, well, that's quite off from the perceptual model. The perceptual model is just a model as well, so all the errors add up. So I want to get that small before we publish it. But for a one single microphone input, time varying sounds, it works quite well. And if you have a 24-hour recording, you can do it on a few minutes on a GPU with that neural network. Last 2 slides, I want to finish with some more advertisement for loudness. So all the spectral loudness summation, binaural loudness summation, it's not something subjective. You see it when you do studies on the human brain. Here we did an MEG study where we looked for correlates with specific loudness. And I was not particularly impressed by this picture that Andy Thwaites, who led on the study, showed me, but other MEG colleagues told me, oh yeah, this is amazing. You almost see how it's organized from low frequencies to high frequencies. So in the MEG world, this is apparently an amazing spatial resolution, and whatever you think of it, there is evidence for this tonotopic structure, and it led to considerably higher correlations than other models, like not considering the tonotopic structure of loudness or just using a Hilbert envelope. Here's some slides from my own PhD, where I looked on whether we can use simple reaction time for loudness. On the left-hand side, I varied the duration of the sound, and participants just were instructed, click the button as soon as you hear the sound. So reaction times got shorter with duration, and after 40 to 50 milliseconds, it wasn't dependent on duration at all. So it might not be exactly the same as loudness, because reaction time might be governed by not exactly the same processes. However, the basic principle is there. There is some temporal integration that also reduces reaction time. And on the right-hand side, I presented them, again, 1 kilohertz pure tones, either diotically binaural to both ears, to the right ear only, and to the left ear only. And you see that the black line has the fastest reaction times. So it's faster, it's louder if you present the sound to both ears. You see a slight difference between the right ear and the left ear. The right ear is a bit faster, and that is because most of our participants were right-handers. And as we found out in another experiment, reaction times are a bit faster when you have it on the same side. And in that other experiment, we asked them to answer with their left hand. And right-handers, they were as quick with their left hand as with their right hand, but the effect of ear was still there. So left hand, left ear is quicker than left ear, right ear. So on the same side is quicker than on the other side. For loudness modeling, this effect is quite annoying. But when you average the blue line and the red line, then the level difference for equal reaction time is pretty exactly 5 to 6 decibels that we know from loudness. So reaction time might be governed by the same effects as loudness. There's something in our auditory pathway that we can demonstrate with other methods that correspond to loudness. This brings me to the end of my talk. So concluding remarks, you might not be surprised that I like the Cambridge loudness model because I contributed to it. It gives accurate predictions for a variety of sounds, for a variety of effects. And for real-world situations, I highly advocate to use partial loudness because sound designers, they could make use of an existing background noise and optimize the sound so that you use that masking that's given by your environment, that you invest your money in frequencies where you actually make a difference and not where it's masked anyway. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Josef. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and if there's any questions in the room, if you could just repeat them back so that people online can also, I was just going to ask, you mentioned about EEG, and I was just wondering what potential there is for using that to investigate loudness and develop it further, and also in terms of other sound qualities as well.
Yeah, so the question was, could we measure loudness by EEG if we invest some research into that? There is some research into using EEG as a correlate of level. It doesn't, it's not as high that you could say it's a real good method. Any behavioral method is much better than that. But EEG is used sometimes to measure the hearing threshold for young children or people who cannot use a graphical user interface or instructions. So there is some application. One question is it accurate for us when we talk about sound quality, about sound design? I think probably not. Our behavioral methods are much better.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Very, very interesting. So during your presentation, you described the whole process of the developing of the models, and it's all very empirical, say. And then you mentioned, okay, adjusting this coefficient is based on experience, expertise is going to increase, improve results and that. And then you went to, and I understand that, of course. And then you went to the machine learning approach.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that if you don't care about what's going on inside, you're going to get it. But are you thinking on using some other approaches in terms of machine learning when you have some physics, some theory involved in the machine learning, so you can have a more, I don't know, trusted results, I would say, or more generalization of the results. Are you looking at that?
Yeah, so the question was about machine learning and if we could use empirical data also in the machine learning approach, not just the model predictions.
No, but my point is not just a single black box machine learning or neural networks, something when you have some sort of a theory or some physics, biology, ideology expertise involved in the machine learning.
Yeah, so we have some thoughts in that direction. The neural network itself, it's always a black box, and we only use it for the purpose of getting a faster computation that gives the same result as the perceptual model. So you could, in theory, make the predictions better and possibly even better than a first principle model if you additionally train the neural network on actual data that participants give you. I think the problem with that is that the overall data that we have available is not that much. We generate like 15, 20 data points in one experiment. So if we go across labs in the world or across time, then maybe we have a few thousands of data points, which is not much for a neural network approach. You could think of different machine learning approaches, which I haven't thought of. I want to develop more approaches where the first principles model and the neural network work together to make predictions, which of course has the slow model involved, but maybe not for the whole 24 hours of the recording, just where I want to have the very precise computations. So you could have the deep neural network to give you interesting parts of the sound, and then you run the slow model on top of that to get your predictions that are as accurate as we can with the model.
Oh, okay. I was going to let you go. I'd be interested to know, I mean, a really interesting work, really enjoyed listening to it in detail. I'm thinking where this falls down. I'm just kind of quite interested. So you've got people, say, with noise sensitivity, or people who find loud sounds get suddenly uncomfortable and distorting. And I'm kind of wondering, where does stuff that goes beyond this fit in? Do you see what I mean? So yeah, a cognitive effect. So you've got your map from your MEG, which is showing all these patterns, but there's a cognitive process on top, presumably, to say how loud it is based on memory and some maybe other factors. I don't understand these areas, so I wouldn't say pen. I'm wondering where that fits into this. Because is there a layer you're missing that goes on top of this, which is varying from individual to individual based on experience or whatever causes noise sensitivity? Or we've got a lot of people looking at neurodiversity and research at the moment, neurodiversity. You know, comment on that?
Yeah, so the question comment was there are layers on top of what I have presented. And first of all, I need to say everything I've presented is for normal hearing listener only. We have the loudness model for hearing impaired listeners, which is not so interesting for noise evaluation because, well, it makes the sounds basically softer. So we think it's mainly important to model normal hearing up to the auditory cortex about. And on top of that, there are further layers, which our loudness model doesn't deal with. So we get the prediction of what's going on in the auditory cortex, but then you have other effects on top of it. You could think of hyperacoustics, like you mentioned. Some people are more sensitive to sounds. You would need to model that extra, that not the average loudness doesn't necessarily say how happy everyone is with a sound. And you have further higher order cognitive effects when you talk about annoyance, which we don't model. We are happy when we reach the auditory cortex. So when people don't like trains and find them more annoying, it's just not covered by that model. Our model is a starting point for that. And I think it helps when you have those loudness values as an input rather than a sound pressure level, because you more closely know what's going on in the auditory cortex from an auditory perspective. But yeah, for real world applications, if you want to predict what people think, then you need to have other models on top of it.
It was essentially the same question.
With slightly different examples. It's fine, good answer.
A question on your machine learning model. I've noticed you presented some results on what seems to be called songs. So
Yeah,
so the other tests were on general everyday sounds, background sounds, speech.
yeah.
This was what? Popular music? That's on CD, MP3 kind of thing?
Yeah, and this was popular music, and as I found out later on, it was badly chosen because due to the loudness compression,
Right.
even though I think I used Beatles or old songs, but remastered versions, so they all had pretty high loudness levels only. If I used classical recording to the higher dynamic range, then I would get more in that low phone range. And with the
Right.
present approach, probably higher RMSEs, because yeah, I've trained on those high loudness levels in speech as well. So yeah, when I do the same again for partial loudness, then I should use a larger dynamic range, not just for the test, because then my life is too difficult, also a bit for the training.
Thank you.
I think we've probably got time for just one last question, and there is one online. Miguel, do you want to unmute?
Hi there. Yeah, thanks. Nice presentation. Thanks very much. Just a couple of things. You know, when you were discussing that particular experiment that you did to decide the precedence between left and right, and you were presenting a modulated sound shifted by 0, 90 or 180 degrees. Is there any paper where I can actually see that again to get my head around it? Because I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah,
Or
so
is it published? Or
it's published. It's in our 2018 paper, and the 2016 paper. The experiments go in the same direction. So these sounds, they don't occur in real life. They are not real world sounds. They are artificial, and we made them specifically to test that hypothesis that binaural inhibition and binaural summation occur at different points of time.
yeah, inhibition and summation. That's the terms. Yeah, okay. I'll try to find. Is there any reference for those papers?
Yeah, I have all the references there. Thank you. So now it's there forever online.
Yeah, great.
So the 2018 paper, Moore et al.
Great. Will we get a copy of the?
So I think Michael will put the whole talk online.
The seminar's been recorded, Miguel. So there will be, I think, an opportunity to see it again, and maybe send the reference list to you as well. Yeah, no problem.
And just finally, when I use the models, is there a rule of thumb to say when I should be using the loudness versus time or the specific loudness, or I just have to go with what I think?
So loudness versus time gives you the loudness. Specific loudness is like a spectrum. It gives you the loudness as a function of frequency.
Yes. So in terms of how a sound varies in time, there's no, I guess I can use, depending on what I think the sound does. If it's stationary, I use specific. And if it's varying to my mind, I can use the versus time, I suppose. That's fine.
So you should, you should always use the time varying loudness model unless you have only a spectrum as an input.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's thank Josef again.